This is part 3 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode focused on continued English and French colonization, destruction of the Abenaki, and settling of the Amazigh Valley. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. This is Dawson. Whenever I look at history before the 19th century, I have to remind myself what kind of world these people are living in. It's not at all like the world we're used to today. The Industrial Revolution changed everything, in bold. One day you're going from all your goods handmade by an individual craftsman to it being churned out en masse by a factory puffing smoke manned by an army. Work changed too. It went from a profession, your life's work, to a 9-to-5, though it didn't get to a literal 9-to-5 for a while. This didn't happen overnight. It may have taken a whole century, but nonetheless, humanity was never the same. In little farming towns like Stamford, you could slowly see this change happening behind a window. It was scary to these people who were living, for lack of a better term, simpler lives, on farms, whose work came as life's work. Slowly, beyond that window, they begin to see these massive brick buildings like fortresses cropping up. Entire hills are moved, rivers diverted. Pretty much the only industry in Stamford besides farming is a sawmill. The lumber that it makes is used to build houses for the people of Stamford, letting them upgrade from their one-room log cabins to salt box houses or colonials, depending on whatever style they want. This revolution that the people of Stamford are seeing through the glass window is beginning to turn its wheels in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. In the 1790s, while our town of Stamford was becoming more of a recognizable town and not just a collection of farms, the Pawtucket Canal was constructed in northeastern Massachusetts, letting loggers upstream on the Merrimack River ship their lumber to the coastal town of Newburyport, while being able to bypass the 30-foot drop of Pawtucket Falls. The usage of that lasted for only 5 years until the Middlesex Canal was completed. This was a problem for the operators of the Pawtucket Canal because the lumber would bypass their canal entirely. The new Middlesex Canal diverged from the Merrimack River a mile upstream from the Pawtucket Canal and ran 27 miles to Boston, rendering the Pawtucket Canal pretty much useless. About 10 years after the functional abandonment of the Pawtucket Canal, a man named Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to England and copied plans for industrial textile machinery because the British government banned international sales of that technology. Francis established the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1813 on the Charles River in Waltham and began the industrial manufacturing of textiles. It became one of the first factories in the United States. A few years later, his successor built a new, bigger mill powered by water on the Pawtucket Canal, and was named the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. Usage of the canal as a source of water power was deemed successful because of the currents generated by the drop from the falls. And after only a few years of operation, the mills and canals were expanded tenfold to form the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. It didn't take long for the news of this to reach the wealthy families of Stamford and other small towns around New England like it. The Stamford, Jackson, and Moody families banded together to create the Stamford Water Works, with the sole purpose of building a system of dams, locks, and canals for manufacturing like those in Lowell. The construction was not immediately started, as there was initially little to no funding. To get funding, Stamford Water Works sold stocks that attracted many Boston investors, and most notably, Jack Dawson, a CEO of a relatively small maritime transport company. As soon as the Stamford Waterworks amassed enough funds from the investors and sales in stocks, construction started on the banks of the Ammonoosuc River under the supervision of a Boston contractor. As there were very few people in the Stamford area at this time, and certainly not enough to build a canal, the contractor hired labor in Boston. In the 1820s, the first wave of Irish immigration began in the United States, especially in Boston. These Irish immigrants were mostly Catholic, and because of that were often called Papists by the Protestants of Boston. Religious historian John Wolfe shows us the kind of situation brewing in Europe and North America in the early 19th century. Quote, "The year 1835 saw the publication of Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States by the inventor and artist Samuel Morse, alleging that Catholic immigration to America was being deliberately encouraged by the papacy and by European absolutist Catholic powers with the intention of subverting republican freedoms. The same year saw a vigorous political campaign in Britain in support of the Church of Ireland as an essential bastion of national Protestantism in the face of Roman Catholicism." End quote. When you mix religion and nationalism, you know you're going to get a good story. Between the 1830s and 1850s, anti-Catholic sentiments got to a dangerous boiling point in Boston, with literal fights in the streets. Protestant preachers provoked their churchgoers by sermoning against Catholicism. In 1835, a prominent Presbyterian preacher, Lyman Beecher, published a book called A Plea for the West, and in it he describes his feelings against the Catholic system. Quote, "The Catholic system is adverse to liberty, and the clergy to a great extent are dependent on foreigners opposed to the principles of our government, for patronage or support. Nor is this all the secular patronage at the disposal of an associated body of men, who, under the influence of their priesthood, may be induced to act as one. For those who favor, and against those who oppose them, would enable them to touch far and wide the spring of action through our cities and through the nation. How many presses might they influence by their promised patronage or threatening withdrawment? How many mechanics, merchants, lawyers, physicians, in any political crisis might they reach and render timid, and temporizing, and prudent not to say sturdy, eulogists of Catholics, lest they should lose the patronage of a sect? Who alone can yield the patronage to favor or punish those who favor or obstruct their views? And if while they are few and feeble, compared with the whole nation, their consolidated action gives them such various and extended influence, how will its power extend and become omnipresent and resistless as emigration shall quadruple their numbers in action on the political and business men of the nation?" End quote. You have to admit it, these are some powerful words, and other people thought that too when it came out. Even to begin with, the United States was a very Protestant nation. In 1642, the colony of Virginia banned Catholic settlers, and not too far after, the Massachusetts Bay Colony did this as well. After almost a century of anti-Catholic laws in New England colonies, William Penn established Pennsylvania as a religious tolerant colony. This attracted mostly Quakers, but also Protestants, Jews, Anglicans, and Roman Catholics, although Catholics were denied the right to vote or to hold office. Pennsylvania continued to attract Catholics, especially those who were in Maryland, which was notoriously anti-Catholic at this time. Even with George Washington's belief in religious tolerance, the integral alliance with Catholic France, and the freedoms of religion in the Bill of Rights, the young United States didn't exactly put its money where its mouth was in terms of religious freedom. Nevertheless, anti-Catholic sentiments brewed in the early 19th century. A book called Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, or The Hidden Secrets of a Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed, became a bestseller. This book claimed that nuns were raped by priests and that infants were murdered, then buried in the convent basement. Modern historians believe that Maria Monk lived in a mental asylum earlier in life and that some nuns in this book were actually patients in that asylum. And today, this book has been described as a hoax by scholars. Regardless, this book became influential on the mainstream image of Catholics in the Protestant United States, and helped to create a very difficult life for Irish Catholic immigrants to Boston. The contractor in charge of building the canals for the Stamford Waterworks needed labor. Who else would be perfect for this but the Irish Catholic immigrants to Boston, who needed to find any work they could? Some 400 Irish immigrants were hired and brought up to the Stamford area. Not only did these Irish Catholic immigrants now have an income, but they were far from Boston and its anti-Catholicism. It was a total win-win. Immigrant labor in the United States has a long history when it comes to infrastructure projects in the 19th century. Immigrants were hired to build canals for mills like in Stamford or Lowell, or build shipping canals like the Erie Canal, and even the Transcontinental Railroad after the Civil War, which had a mixture of emancipated slaves and immigrants from Ireland and China. This work was hard, backbreaking, and the pay wasn't great. But it was almost guaranteed work, and certainly helped those who needed to get away from religious or ethnic tensions in the cities. I think that's a force that we often overlook today. The very first thing that the Stamford Waterworks did once a little funding was available was not anything to do with canals, locks, or dams, but instead built a wooden bridge across the Amesec River to the neighboring farming village of White. Recently before this, wealthy families of White founded the Stamford Falls Academy overlooking the waterfall, so that they could give their children an early on, high-quality education without sending them far away to places like Dartmouth College. Now, the newly constructed bridge across the Amesec let the wealthier families of Stamford send their children to the Stamford Falls Academy. Alongside the construction of the waterworks and bridge projects, Jack Dawson planned a sprawling mill complex inspired by that in Lowell, just as the waterworks project was. Dawson's mill company would be named after the river, so he named it the Amesec Manufacturing Company. In 1835, after some housing for the Irish laborers was constructed, a few buildings between the bridge and the academy were built, and Jack Dawson began construction on his mill complex. The owners of the Stamford Waterworks realized that a plan for future development in the area would be needed before any serious conflicts came up. As a solution, a Boston company was hired to plan this. The new plan consisted of a top-down map of the area with high topographic detail, showing current streets and buildings, streets to be built, current major landholdings of farmers, canals and public squares to be built, land contours, and future mill lots. With Jack Dawson being the one with the biggest stake on the future of the town and the biggest investor all around, the town would be named Dawson after him. In order to protect the identity of the small Protestant farming town of Stamford, the local investors decided to split its landholdings in two, with Stamford as a Protestant farm town on the outskirts of Dawson on the banks of the Amesec River, consisting of the land acreage already laid out in the land usage plan. The first pressing matter of this new town of Dawson was to start construction of the grid-planned roads and bridges over canals from the land usage plan. As the town grew, the first Roman Catholic congregation was established, and for some time, Mass was held in a wooden church and hosted by traveling priests. In 1841, the first few buildings of the Amesec Manufacturing Company mill complex were finished. Mill Building No. 1 was finished in 1835, and the next two buildings were finished before 1841. Alongside these mill buildings, housing was constructed to house local women from Stamford who would work in the mills in a labor and production model called the Waltham-Lowell system, where these single young local women from the farms would work in the textile mills and live in boarding houses provided by the mill company, who were called mill girls, and often between the ages of 15 and 35. Their lives were very strictly controlled and organized, and when these women raked in enough cash, they left to go back to the family's farm. In mainstream history, they're termed Lowell mill girls, though they existed in mills across New England, though the mill girls of Lowell are the most prominent. After all, they laid down one of the first movements of workers' rights in the United States. A former worker at one of these Lowell cotton mills by the name of Harriet Hanson Robinson writes, quote, "One of the first strikes of cotton factory operatives that ever took place in this country was that in Lowell in October 1835. When it was announced that the wages were to be cut down, great indignation was felt, and it was decided to strike en masse. This was done. The mills were shut down, and the girls went in procession from their several corporations to the Grove on Chapel Hill and listened to incendiary speeches from early labor reformers. One of the girls stood on a pump and gave vent to the feelings of her companions in a neat speech, declaring that it was their duty to resist all attempts at cutting down the wages. This was the first time a woman had spoken in public in Lowell, and the event caused surprise and consternation among her audience. Cutting down the wages was not their only grievance, nor only cause of this strike. Hitherto, the corporations had paid 25 cents a week towards the board of each operative, and now it was their purpose to have the girls pay the sum. And this, in addition to the cut in wages, would make a difference of at least $1 a week. It was estimated that as many 12 or 1,500 girls turned out and walked in procession through the streets. They had neither flags nor music, but sang songs. A favorite, but rather inappropriate, one being a parody of "I Won't Be a Nun." End quote. This strike resulted in Harriet Hanson Robinson becoming an important figure in the women's suffrage movement. Her work as an author was, and still is, extremely influential within the suffrage movement. The Lowell Mill Girls' strikes earned better living conditions for themselves. In an 1842 trip to Lowell, novelist Charles Dickens spent the happiest day he had spent in the country during his visit in Lowell. Taken out of the pages of the book on his visit titled Dickens, The Lowell Mill Girls, and the Making of a Christmas Carol by Professor Natalie McKnight, quote, "Dickens toured a woolen factory, a carpet factory, and the Merrimack Manufacturing Company textile mill during his stay in Lowell. As he writes in American Notes for General Circulation," she's quoting him here now, "I happened to arrive at the first factory just as the dinner hour was over, and the girls were returning to their work. Indeed, the stairs of the mill were thronged with them as I ascended. They were all well dressed, but not to my thinking above their condition." His account goes on to say that they were healthy in appearance, many of them remarkably so, and had the manners and deportment of young women, not of degraded brutes of burden, as his tours of factories in England had led him to expect. He notes that there were many just verging upon womanhood. He also notes their extreme cleanliness, a factor of great importance to him as he was preoccupied with the cleanliness and order. But Dickens was likewise impressed by the attractiveness of the girls' surroundings. As he describes in American Notes, the rooms in which they worked were as well ordered as themselves. In windows of some, there were green plants, which were trained to shade the glass. In all, there was as much fresh air, cleanliness, and comfort as the nature of this occupation would possibly admit of. Compared to what Dickens had seen of factories in Britain, which were run down with little or no concern for the comfort or even health of the workers, Lowell was a surprising and hopeful revelation. On the 29th of December, 1838, 4 years before his visit to America, Dickens had written to E.M. Fitzgerald, "I went, some weeks ago, to Manchester and saw the worst cotton mill, and then I saw the best. There was no great difference between them." He went on to say that what he saw disgusted and astonished me beyond all measure. I meant to strike the heaviest blow in my power for these unfortunate creatures, but whether I shall do so in the Nickleby or wait some other opportunity, I have not yet determined. The blow he ended up striking was A Christmas Carol, although its connection to factory conditions is not immediately obvious. McKnight continues. The boarding houses for the mill girls also impressed Dickens since they were close to the mills, and their proximity to the factories meant that the woman could return to the house for a decent dinner in the middle of the day. They did not have to spend much of their time commuting to work, as was the case for most mill workers in England. For instance, Matthew Crabtree, a British factory worker, who was called to testify in Parliament's investigation of child labour in 1831-32, started working in a factory when he was 8 years old and regularly worked 14 hours a day with an hour break at noon, with 16-hour days when business was brisk. By contrast, Lowell mill girls worked 12-hour days. Crabtree lived 2 miles from the mill, which would add over an hour to his workday, leaving him less than 8 hours to sleep when he got home, even if he did nothing else. When asked by the investigator how he managed to get up in the morning, he answered, "I seldom did awake spontaneously. I was most generally awoke or lifted out of bed, sometimes asleep, by my parents." When asked if he was always on time in getting to work, he replied no, and said that the consequence was, "I was mostly commonly beaten." "Severely?" the interrogator asked. "Very severely, I thought." He responded, "In those mills, is chastisement toward the later part of the day going on perpetually?" he was asked. "Perpetually," he responded. "So that you can hardly be in a mill without hearing constant crying?" "Never an hour, I believe." End quote. What more can you say about that? The Lowell mill girls did some amazing things for the working conditions in these mills. Alongside the mill girls, many Irish workers who did not work in infrastructure projects anymore were employed in these mills. These Irish workers tended to be not as organized and were, in consequence, much cheaper laborers than the mill girls, and until around 1850, mill girls were phased out in favor of this cheaper immigrant labor. History sees several waves of workers' rights in these mill cities, and, with the mass industrialization and first trickle of French-Canadian immigrants in the next 10 years, we've yet to see what the working conditions in the mills are really capable of. Thanks for watching or listening to the 3rd episode of Dawson. If you liked this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 4 drops. If you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt.